Chapter 1. The Crib with Burn. Marks. The church bells of Little Witchwood chimed a gentle peal across the meadows, the kind of sound that seemed stitched into the sky itself, too soft to startle, too familiar to ignore. On such a day, with clouds like sheep drifting over the fields and the rose bushes along the vicarage gate heavy with bloom, no one expected death to arrive in a pram. The annual Michaelmas fete had begun with all the comforting predictability of village life. Stalls were pitched in the churchyard, jam jars glinting in sunlight, scones rising under embroidered cloths, and Reverend Pettigrew's tombola table slightly crooked as always. Miss Marple, dressed in a robin's egg blue cardigan and sensible straw hat, had taken her place beneath the apple tree, contentedly knitting and observing the parade of human behavior with that soft, owl-like gaze of hers. The center of attention that year was the new couple at Fallow's Reach, Jeremy and Fiona Ranscombe, recently arrived from London, bringing with them an aura of urban modernity that unsettled many. Fiona, with her sleek auburn hair and clipped vowels, had instantly offended Mrs. Price by requesting decaffeinated tea. Jeremy, tall and grey-suited even in August, had found it difficult to conceal his impatience when confronted with the slow-moving raffle queue. Yet Fiona's apparent earnestness, her attempt to join the fete committee within a week of moving in, had won her some reluctant goodwill. And then there was baby Edward, with his startling green eyes and the antique whitewood crib she insisted on wheeling about like something from a Victorian museum. Miss Marple had just switched from garter-stitch to pearl when the scream came. It wasn't loud, but it had that tight, breathless quality that sliced through all chatter. It came from behind the church where the temporary creche had been set up, an area shaded by 2 large oaks and cordoned off with bunting. Several mothers had left their infants there under the watchful eye of young Nancy Clure, the vicar's niece. Nancy, bright-cheeked and excitable, was often more interested in chatting than child-minding, though no one had ever thought her careless. Until now. Within seconds, villagers surged toward the sound. Miss Marple, naturally, did not rush. She folded her knitting calmly and made her way through the dispersing crowd, noting how Mrs. Bartlett clutched her pearls dramatically, and how young Martin Fletchley, always too eager to be useful, had already fetched Reverend Pettigrew with puffed cheeks and flapping sleeves. The small crowd parted with uneasy reverence as Miss Marple approached the crib. It lay oddly tilted on the grass, one of its little wheels twisted askew. The old whitewood frame was still mostly intact, but scorch marks fanned out across the inside, jagged black tendrils reaching toward the delicate embroidery of the baby blanket. There was no smoke now, no heat, just the acrid tang of something burnt and the creeping silence that often follows something irreversibly wrong. The baby, Edward Ranscombe, was missing. Fiona stood nearby, her face a porcelain mask of shock. One trembling hand pressed against her throat, the other clenched the charred corner of the baby blanket. "He was just here," she kept repeating, voice oddly flat. "He was just here. I went to get him some cooled milk. I was gone only 3 minutes." Nancy Clure wept openly, her hands fluttering about like butterflies without a flower. I thought he was napping. I only turned to help Vera buckle with her twins. It was only a moment, truly. Someone asked about footprints. Someone else was already shouting about police, but Miss Marple's eyes were not on the frantic villagers. They were on the crib. Burn marks. Not an accident, not a careless candle or a dropped match. There had been no source of open flame nearby. The heat damage was contained, precise, centered only within the cot. A message, perhaps. Or a warning. Or a lie. By evening, Inspector Cray had arrived from Market Hemley. He was a square-faced man who had once told Miss Marple, rather officiously, that she had a most untidy mind for an amateur. He now greeted her with slightly more politeness, though not by much. "There's no sign of the child," he reported grimly. "We've questioned everyone present. Grounds searched. No footprints in the grass beyond what we'd expect from the crowd. No ransom note either, though it's early. We're looking into the parents' background, of course. And that girl, Nancy, useless in a crisis." Miss Marple merely nodded, her eyes drifting back toward the scorched crib. "And this?" she asked gently. "Was it confirmed to be arson?" Cray frowned. "Not yet. But something odd. There's no soot, not really. No residue you'd expect, almost like heat came from within rather than from outside. We've got a man from the fire service coming tomorrow." "How very curious," murmured Miss Marple. She turned then, offering a benign smile to Mrs. Price, who was murmuring darkly about Romany curses and careless mothers. Night fell over Little Witchwood with an unnatural hush. In the parlor of Fallow's Reach, Fiona sat unmoving before a cold cup of tea. Jeremy, for once dishevelled, paced in short, rigid lines near the hearth. "No one's asked about the will," he muttered, "or the inheritance. That's good. For now." Fiona blinked slowly, as though she hadn't heard. Back in her rose-covered cottage, Miss Marple sat with her evening tea and a copy of the Times, though she was not reading. She was thinking. A child had vanished in the heart of a village fete, a place woven of gossip, pettiness, and long memory. And someone had made certain that what remained was a burned crib, left like a question no one yet knew how to answer. But Miss Marple, who had seen many things in her quiet years, things darker than anyone ever suspected, already felt the tug of threads beneath the surface. This would not be a simple matter of a missing child. And someone, somewhere in Little Witchwood, had lit a very particular fire. Chapter 2. The Village Reacts. By the following morning, Little Witchwood was steeped in the kind of hushed tension that usually accompanied royal funerals, or especially vicious rhubarb rivalries. The baby's disappearance had spread through the village like spilt ink on blotting paper. Dark, spreading, impossible to control. At Denby's grocer, murmurs flitted over sacks of barley and tins of sardines. At the post office, letters remained unsorted as Miss Tilbury leaned over the counter, wide-eyed and urgent, whispering to whomever would listen. "Taken straight from his crib, they say," she confided to the widow Hartnell. "And in broad daylight. I always said that couple was odd. London airs, a woman who wheels an antique crib around like a parade float. Strange priorities." Mrs. Hartnell clucked her tongue, tapping her umbrella sharply on the flagstone floor. "Mark my words, it's to do with that nursemaid girl. That Cluer child. Too much lipstick, too many novels. Barely more than a schoolgirl. No sense of duty." In the corner, Mr. Aberley, who had delivered milk to Fallow's Reach every morning since May, folded his arms. "No use blaming young girls," he grumbled. Saw that Jeremy Ranscombe arguing on the phone the morning before. Red in the face he was. Wouldn't be surprised if this was some family mess. Blackmail, maybe. At the village green, preparations for dismantling the fete had been halted. The bunting still sagged between the trees, cheerful and wrong in the silence. Nancy Cluer had not come out of her aunt's cottage since the night before, and the vicarage curtains remained tightly drawn. Miss Marple, meanwhile, took her morning walk along the lane with her usual measured pace, umbrella in one hand, gloves carefully buttoned at the wrist. Her path led her, not incidentally, past Fallow's Reach. The house stood like a misplaced stone in the soft countryside, too angular, too proud. The curtains were shut tight, but through a gap on the upper floor, Miss Marple glimpsed a faint flicker, movement. Someone watching. She continued on without pause. At mid-morning, Inspector Cray held a gathering in the parish hall, which had quickly become the epicenter of speculation. A blackboard stood behind him, incongruously marked with a schedule for the jam-tart competition. "We have no confirmed sightings of the child," Cray stated. "The fire in the crib remains under investigation. At present, no ransom note has been received. We are treating this as a possible abduction, and inquiries into the Ranscombs' personal affairs are ongoing. I remind you that speculation is harmful. If anyone observed anything suspicious, no matter how small, you must report it." He paused, scanning the faces in front of him. "And I must ask all villagers to avoid disturbing the fete grounds further. Forensics is coming down from Oxford." There was a ripple of interest at the word forensics, though no one quite knew what it entailed. From the back row, Mrs. Price raised a hand, rings clinking. "I assume," she said, voice like marmalade left too long in the pan, "that the girl responsible, the one who lost the child, has been taken in for questioning." "Miss Cluer has given her account," said Cray. "We're verifying her timeline. That is all I can say for now." Mrs. Bartlett leaned across to her friend. "Did you hear about the footprints in the orchard?" "False?" Miss Marple murmured gently, her voice low but calm. "Those were from Reverend Pettigrew's nephew. He'd gone to fetch lemonade and took a shortcut." The women blinked at her. "I see," said Mrs. Bartlett, clearly disappointed. After the meeting, Miss Marple lingered by the notice board. A small pinned flyer caught her attention, an advertisement for a local art workshop. Fiona Ranscombe had signed her name at the bottom, volunteering to teach sketching. The date was 2 days before the fete. Curious timing, Miss Marple had not seen her attend. Behind her, someone cleared their throat. It was young Martin Fletchley, red-eared and perpetually apologetic. "Miss Marple," he said awkwardly, "I didn't want to speak up in there, but see, well, it may be nothing." She turned to him with a soft smile. "Often, Mr. Fletchley, it's the nothings that become somethings when properly examined." He blushed. "It's only, when I was taking down the canvas awnings that morning, I saw Mr. Ranscombe near the creche. He wasn't with Mrs. Ranscombe. Just standing there, alone, not looking in, just standing." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Thank you. I do hope you'll share that with Inspector Cray as well." "Oh, I wasn't sure. He seemed rather quick to close the book on things." "He often is," said Miss Marple dryly. That afternoon, Fiona Ranscombe was seen walking toward the church. She moved slowly, as though each step were uncertain ground. At the lych gate, she paused to speak to Reverend Pettigrew, who looked visibly uncomfortable. Later, he confided in Miss Marple over tea. She asked about holding a small vigil, he said, stirring his cup too quickly. "No hymns, just candlelight, for Edward." But there was something strange in her manner. "Grief takes many shapes," said Miss Marple. "Yes, but she asked, specifically, that we do it behind the church, near the oak trees, where the creche had been." Miss Marple looked over the rim of her teacup, thoughtful. "That is rather particular." He nodded, lowering his voice. "She also said, quite out of the blue, that Edward had no enemies, that no one would ever want to hurt him." "No mother wishes to believe otherwise," Miss Marple replied. "Still, it is an unusual thing to assert unprompted, don't you think?" Later that evening, the police returned to Fallow's Reach with dogs. Miss Marple, sitting in her drawing room beside a quiet fire, heard them pass. But no cries went up, no child was found. She laid down her embroidery and opened her notebook. Not to write, yet, but simply to look at the page. Empty, for now, like the crib that haunted every corner of the village's thoughts. She stared at it a long moment. There had been fire, yes, but there had also been silence. And that, she thought, was far more dangerous. Chapter 3. Early Investigation. The morning mist had not yet lifted from the hedgerows when Miss Marple visited the fete grounds again. She moved with quiet purpose, pausing now and then to observe the earth, to lift a fallen ribbon or smooth a trampled corner of grass. To any casual passerby, She appeared to be a sweet old lady lamenting the disorder left behind by an untimely tragedy. But her mind, always meticulous, was busy arranging pieces of a puzzle that others had not yet noticed had begun. The burned crib had been removed for examination, but the blackened patch on the grass remained. Some of the village children had already started a rumor that if you stood too close, you'd feel a chill run up your back. Miss Marple, who did exactly that, felt no chill, only the press of absence. She stood for several moments beside the scorched patch, her expression unreadable. Then she turned and began her walk back through the trees behind the church. There, hidden among the tall grass near the farthest oak, she noticed something glinting in the undergrowth. Stooping with difficulty, she retrieved it, a small tin whistle on a blue cord, slightly melted at the edge. A child's toy, it might have been Edward's. Later, she would give it to Inspector Cray, who would log it indifferently. But in that moment, Miss Marple turned it over gently in her hands, and her thoughts were far away, recalling a different child in a different village and a long-forgotten scandal involving nursery staff and unattended hours. At the same hour, Fiona Ranscombe sat in the vicarage with her hands clenched tightly in her lap. Nancy Cleur sat opposite her, pale and visibly trembling. Reverend Pettigrew stood awkwardly between them like a poorly placed statue. "I've already told the police," Nancy said for the third time, voice shaking. "He was napping. I only turned to help Vera with the Buckle twins. I turned back and he was gone. That's the whole of it." Fiona's voice was low, brittle. "Were you talking to anyone while he slept? Anyone near the cordon?" "No," Nancy whispered. I heard something, a sort of crackle. I thought it was someone stepping on twigs, but then I smelled it. Burnt fabric." "And you didn't see anyone?" Fiona's words were clipped, urgent. "No, only the smoke. I screamed, and people came running." Miss Marple arrived shortly after, her face calm as always. "I do hope I'm not intruding, but I've brought some lemon barley water. Nancy, you look rather worn." The vicar gratefully stepped aside, and Miss Marple sat beside the girl, gently placing the bottle in front of her. "Such a dreadful thing," she murmured. "I remember a case once, back in Much Benham, where a child vanished after a whist drive. Entirely different, of course. But one does find that the smallest detail can be the start of everything." Fiona stood quickly, clearly rattled by the intrusion. "We were discussing—" "Yes, of course," Miss Marple said softly. "I only wanted to ask, Fiona, was that the same crib you mentioned in your letter to the parish newsletter? The antique one from your family estate?" Fiona hesitated. "No, that crib was damaged in transit. This one we bought from a collector in Oxford. I thought it was beautiful. Jeremy said it was ridiculous." Miss Marple nodded as if the matter were of little importance. "Odd how men see different things in objects, don't you find?" She left not long after, offering a quiet word to the vicar on her way out. As she walked home, she passed Vera Buckle, who was balancing a toddler on one hip and trying to hold on to a bag of potatoes with the other. "Mrs. Buckle," Miss Marple said kindly, "I was told you were near the creche when the incident happened. I do hope your little ones are none the worse." "Oh, thank goodness no, Miss Marple. Just frightened. Horrid business. That poor girl, Nancy. I know she seems flighty, but she loves the babies. Really, she does." "You saw her leave the children's area?" Vera paused. "Yes, just for a second. One of my twins had a thorn in her hand, crying fit to burst. Nancy helped me find the first aid box. I don't think she was gone more than half a minute." "Was anyone else standing close by during that time?" Vera frowned, struggling to recall. "There was someone near the corner of the creche, behind the bunting. I thought it might be one of the Ranscombes' friends. They had a few up from London, didn't they?" "Did you recognize the person?" "No. They had a cap on, bent down like they were tying a shoe." Miss Marple thanked her and moved on, the information sliding quietly into place alongside the melted whistle, the second crib, the oddly specific request for a vigil. The picture was beginning to form. Not fully, not yet, but enough for her to feel its shape. That evening, as the village prepared for another cold and silent night, Inspector Cray called a second meeting at the hall. Fewer people came this time. Grief and fear had begun to settle into resignation. "We're expanding the search area," Cray announced. "It's likely the child was removed from the fete grounds before the alarm was raised. We're also reviewing security footage from the bus station and train depot in Market Hemley." "But who would do such a thing?" wailed Mrs. Hartnell from the front row. "A child, Inspector—" Cray's face remained stony. "That's what we intend to find out." Miss Marple sat quietly, knitting in her lap, eyes drifting once again to the blackboard behind Cray. Someone had left a note pinned there. They always think it's the mother first. No one else seemed to notice it, but Miss Marple stared at the words a long while. When she returned home, she didn't go straight to bed. Instead, she pulled a box from the shelf. Old letters, pressed flowers, yellowing newspaper clippings. She found what she was looking for at the bottom, a photograph of a woman she'd once known. A quiet widow whose child had also vanished without trace. That case had not ended well. But this one, Miss Marple vowed silently, would not slip away in the fog. Not if she could help it. Chapter 4. First Suspects. By Tuesday morning, the village had reached the stage of communal unease where whispered suspicions curdled into quiet accusations. Little Witchwood, though tidy in appearance, had never been immune to gossip. And now, with a child vanished and a burnt crib at the center of things, everyone had begun rearranging their smiles into questions. The police had not yet named a suspect, but the villagers had. Two, in fact. The first was Nancy Clure. It was an easy choice, young, emotional, and already prone to social criticism for her painted nails and fashionable skirts. Never mind that she'd been volunteering at the church nursery for 2 years without incident. She had, after all, turned away. And what sort of girl could misplace a child, even for a moment? Miss Marple, however, had noted something else: Nancy's genuine remorse. It was not the keening sorrow of someone trying to look innocent, but a deeply uncomfortable grief that made her avoid eye contact, choke on her tea, and flinch at the sound of a baby's cry. That sort of suffering, Miss Marple knew, was not easily faked. The second suspect came as a surprise to no one: Jeremy Ranscombe himself. He had been observed, once, perhaps twice, alone near the creche, pacing in a distracted manner. Martin Fletchley had confirmed it, and now Mrs. O'Way Price claimed she'd also seen Jeremy speaking in hushed tones behind the bunting, though whether she'd seen it before the fire or after changed depending on who was asking. Inspector Cray, to his credit, was not ignoring the village's suspicions. He summoned Jeremy to the vicarage for formal questioning. Jeremy arrived with his usual stiffness, dressed in a crisp white shirt with the sleeves unrolled despite the heat. His face had thinned in the days since the fete, and the circles under his eyes hinted at sleepless nights. But still he carried himself with the restrained arrogance of a man used to being listened to. Cray began, simply, "Where were you at the exact moment your son disappeared?" Jeremy exhaled through his nose. "My wife had gone to fetch milk. I had just finished speaking with Mr. Braithwaite about the fundraising accounts. I walked over toward the creche, but didn't go in. I trusted Nancy." "You were seen standing near the corner of the area?" "Yes, for no more than a minute." "Why?" Jeremy's fingers tapped once against his leg. "Honestly, to check that Edward hadn't woken. He's fussy after 11 in the morning." "And did he look awake?" "I couldn't see properly. The bunting was strung too high." Cray stared at him. "Did you see anyone else standing nearby?" "No." "Did you smell anything? Hear anything? Jeremy hesitated. I thought I caught the scent of burning, but I dismissed it. There were barbecues nearby. Cray said nothing for a while. Then, are you aware of anyone who might wish harm upon your family? Jeremy's jaw twitched. We're not people of importance, Inspector. We don't have enemies. Fiona left her position at the university amicably. I'm in finance. We moved here to find peace. Cray raised a brow. Yet we've discovered a court dispute involving your sister, custody of her child. A heated one. Were you involved? Jeremy's eyes narrowed. My sister is irrelevant. Edward is her nephew. My sister, Jeremy said flatly, has not spoken to me in 4 years. She lives in Devon. If you're suggesting she kidnapped my son, you're wasting time. Miss Marple, seated quietly in the vicar's sitting room for reasons no one quite questioned, observed this exchange with the soft gaze of one engaged in embroidery. Her hands moved calmly, but her ears heard everything. Later, when Jeremy left, she made a small remark to the vicar. He said Fiona left her position at the university amicably. How odd. How so? The vicar asked. I could have sworn I overheard Fiona mention during the church tea that her resignation had been unpleasant, I believe was her word. She said she didn't miss the politics. Curious, isn't it, how husbands sometimes simplify events for public telling? The vicar hesitated. You think it matters? Oh, I never think anything outright, Reverend. I only notice, that's all. By midweek, Nancy Cleur was brought in for additional questioning, much to the villagers' delight. Some took it as proof of guilt. Others, like Miss Marple, took it as proof of police frustration. Cray questioned Nancy for over an hour. She emerged with a tear-streaked face and refused to speak to anyone, not even her aunt. That evening, she packed a bag and disappeared to her cousins in Bramley, unable to bear the stairs. Miss Marple walked home slowly that night, watching the way people stepped back from one another. Suspicion had begun to thread through the hedges and teacups. At the grocer, people no longer lingered to chat. At the bakery, Mrs. Denton forgot to smile, and still the crib remained burned. Miss Marple decided to visit Fiona the next morning. She brought a loaf of currant bread and was admitted reluctantly. Fiona sat in the parlour, staring at the cold grate. Thank you, she said faintly. I suppose I should eat. Miss Marple watched her for a long moment, then spoke gently. There's something I feel you should know, Fiona. When I was young, a cousin of mine lost her child. Not to crime, but illness. She spent the first week blaming everyone else, and the second blaming herself. It wasn't until the 3rd week she allowed herself to grieve. Fiona looked up slowly. I'm not sure what I feel anymore. It's all frozen. Everything. Miss Marple nodded. Sometimes the people around us don't help. Even those we trust. Even those closest to us. Fiona flinched almost imperceptibly. Miss Marple stood. If there's anything you remember, any small detail, no matter how foolish it may seem, you must speak it. I will. But she didn't. Not yet. As Miss Marple walked home, the breeze picked up through the hedgerows. It stirred the rose petals, scattered them like ashes across the lane. 2 suspects had emerged, one convenient, one compelling. But Miss Marple knew better than to settle too early. Sometimes the truth wore another's face and bided its time in silence. Chapter 5. A Hidden Clue. It was Thursday when Miss Marple first noticed the nursery rhyme. She had returned to the fete grounds to speak with the groundskeeper, Mr. Blore, regarding the timeline for clearing the debris. Though blunt and half-deaf, Mr. Blore had a fondness for Miss Marple, and the two often exchanged words about roses and weather. That morning, he was sorting through the storage bins behind the parish hall, where the fete's leftover materials had been dumped in a tangle of bunting, folding chairs, and laminated signs. Well now, he grunted, lifting an overturned basket. Would you look at this mess? Carnival waste is always worse than it looks. Huh, there it is. Someone left a child's bag, see? He handed it to Miss Marple, a small navy blue canvas satchel with faded red piping along the edges. Inside, she found a crumpled muslin cloth, a half-used bottle of teething gel, and a child's soft-bound storybook, Old Mother Goose and Her Rhymes. She flipped through the pages, pausing at one. It had been dog-eared and marked in pencil. The rhyme read, "Sleep, my child, and do not cry. I shall see you by and by. But if you wake and find me gone, follow not where I have gone." Underneath, in shaky pencil, someone had written, "Not for Edward, ever." Miss Marple blinked slowly. The handwriting was rough, uneven, perhaps written in haste. Perhaps not by Fiona, perhaps not even meant to be seen. Still, it felt pointed. A rhyme crossed out. A child warned away. It had been in the lost and found bin, not in the crib. So why had it been marked so deliberately? She tucked the book into her handbag and offered Mr. Blore a smile. "Thank you, Mr. Blore. You're always a help." He squinted at her and nodded. "Nothing goes missing in this village? Not really," he muttered. "It just hides until someone looks proper." Those words stuck with her. Back in her cottage, Miss Marple laid the book on the kitchen table and fetched her spectacles. She compared the pencil scrawl with a note Fiona had written to the Fete Committee. A polite RSVP signed, "Warmest regards, Fiona Ranscombe." The hand was different. The note in the book was firmer, more deliberate, less careful. Later that day, she strolled to the vicarage and asked Reverend Pettigrew a question that seemed almost idle. "Do you recall who packed away the nursery materials after the fete?" He furrowed his brow. "I believe it was Nancy. She and Martin Fletchley. They offered to help. Why?" "Just curious. Sometimes the little things vanish not from theft, but from accident." As she turned to leave, the vicar added, "Speaking of little things, did you know Fiona declined our offer for meal assistance? Said she and Jeremy were fine, but I've heard they've hardly touched their groceries since Sunday." Miss Marple paused at the door. "Grief suppresses appetite, certainly, but not always for the same reasons." That evening, a light drizzle began to fall over the village. The bunting had finally come down. The fete was reduced to a few ruts in the grass, and a memory no one wanted to speak of. Inspector Cray arrived at Fallow's Reach with a folder of new inquiries and found Jeremy pacing the parlour with a glass of whiskey in hand. Fiona sat by the window again, wrapped in the same dove-grey shawl she'd worn 3 days running. "Do you recognize this?" Cray asked, showing them the nursery book. Fiona looked at it blankly. Jeremy leaned in closer, frowning. Yes, it's Edward's. Fiona read it to him in the evenings." "There's a rhyme marked," Cray said, with a note beneath. "Do you know who wrote it?" Fiona took the book, read the page, and inhaled sharply. "I know. That's not my writing. I would never say such a thing." Jeremy's eyes narrowed. "Let me see." He read the note, his brow furrowed. "That's Martin Fletchley's handwriting, isn't it? He helped Fiona set up the nursery tent. They spent hours organizing it." Fiona turned toward him, startled. "Martin? No, he wouldn't." But Cray had already scribbled a note. Miss Marple, of course, had arrived minutes later with a plate of scones under the polite guise of concern. "Detective work?" she said sweetly, spying the open folder. Cray grunted. "Possibly. We may need to speak to young Mr. Fletchley again." Miss Marple placed the scones on the coffee table and folded her hands. "A very earnest boy, Martin. Prone to crushes, I believe. Infatuated with someone just last year. Cynthia Bletch, wasn't it?" Fiona looked up suddenly. "He once brought me a bouquet of daisies. I thought it was sweet. I didn't think—" No, Miss Marple said kindly. "Likely it meant nothing. But such gestures sometimes grow in the giver's imagination. Affection, when it isn't returned, can become resentment. And resentment, if given the right circumstances, can become dangerous. Inspector Cray stared at her. "You're suggesting Martin kidnapped Edward?" Miss Marple smiled. "I'm suggesting that people are rarely dangerous in the way we expect. If Martin did write the note, it could mean many things. Perhaps only that he thought Fiona too protective. Or perhaps he thought he was helping in some twisted way." Cray rubbed his temples. "You'll drive me mad, Miss Marple." "Not if I can help you first," she replied gently. That night, Miss Marple walked home in the rain, shawl clutched around her shoulders. The rhyme echoed in her head. "But if you wake and find me gone, follow not where I have gone." It didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a warning. One left not for the child, but for someone else. Perhaps the writer was trying to stop something, or confess to something already done. Either way, it was a clue. Small, hidden, but sharp enough to burn. Chapter 6. Confrontations and Secrets. Friday arrived wrapped in fog, the kind that seemed to cling to window panes and creep beneath doors. The village of Little Witchwood, normally awake by 7:30 with clattering milk bottles and garden shears, remained curiously subdued. Curtains stayed drawn longer than usual. Shopkeepers opened late. Even the birds seemed hesitant. But Miss Marple had already been to the baker's and back, a warm paper bag tucked under her arm. She was expecting company. Martin Fletchley arrived at 9:30 on the dot, just as she knew he would. She had asked him round for a small favour, her excuse being a jam jar stuck too tight for her old wrists to manage. Martin, obliging and flustered as ever, had accepted instantly. Young men did not often say no to Miss Marple, especially when she asked so politely. "Come in, dear boy," she said with a smile, leading him into her neat little kitchen. "Do sit down. You look positively damp." Martin took off his coat, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed. "It's the fog. Clings to everything. You said something about a jar." Yes, but we'll get to that in a moment." She set the bag of pastries on the table. "I thought perhaps we might talk first. I've been thinking about Edward's disappearance and, well, you've been such a helpful young man. I thought perhaps you'd notice something." Martin stiffened ever so slightly. "I already told the inspector everything I know." "Oh, I'm sure you did. But sometimes the police are so brisk. People forget the small things, the human things." She offered him a cinnamon bun. "For example, did you notice Fiona Ranscombe seemed troubled in the days before the fete?" He hesitated. "She was tired. She always seemed tired." "Indeed. But did she say anything? About the child? Or about anyone bothering her?" Martin avoided her gaze. "No. Well, not exactly." Miss Marple's tone remained cheerful. "Not exactly." He squirmed in his chair. "She mentioned once, just once, that she wished things were simpler, that she missed her life before, all of it. The house, the child, the village. She said she missed her life before Edward." Martin flinched. No, not like that. She just sounded overwhelmed." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked once, though she wasn't holding them. Her gaze remained steady. "Did you write in Edward's nursery book?" Martin blinked. What?" "The rhyme, the warning, the pencil note under it." He paled. "No, I may have doodled in it. I was tidying the books. But I don't remember writing that. Truly." "Even though it's your handwriting?" He looked panicked now. "I didn't mean anything by it. I just thought, well, Fiona always read that rhyme. I found it sad. I crossed it out. I didn't think anyone would see." Miss Marple nodded, still gentle. "And what of the daisies you gave her?" That stopped him. "She told you about that?" "Of course. People always tell me things eventually." Martin looked away, cheeks burning. "I liked her, I suppose. But it wasn't like that. She was kind to me, and I thought maybe..." But then I realized she was just being polite. I wouldn't hurt Edward, I swear it. She laid a hand lightly on his. I believe you, Martin, but sometimes feelings, even innocent ones, become tangled. He nodded miserably. I only wanted to help. And you still can, she said kindly. Tell the inspector what you told me. He needs to know. Martin promised he would. When he left, Miss Marple watched him vanish into the mist like a figure in a ghost story. But the air in her sitting room had changed. The pieces were slowly shifting. That afternoon, a second confrontation played out. This one more private. At the vicarage, Fiona Ranscombe sat again with Reverend Pettigrew. She had requested the meeting herself. Her posture was rigid, her eyes hollowed out by sleeplessness. She looked not like a grieving mother, but like someone who had been peeled open and left raw. I need to tell someone, she said at last. I need to say it out loud. The vicar leaned forward. Whatever it is, my dear, you're safe here. She nodded, fingers trembling in her lap. Jeremy didn't want Edward, she said flatly. Not at first. He said we weren't ready. He said a child would trap us here, in a life we didn't choose. He thought we should have ended the pregnancy. I refused. The vicar blinked. I see. He came around, eventually, or at least he pretended to, but after we moved here, things changed. He started pulling away. Then we had a fight, the day before the fete. What was it about? I told him I wanted to go back to work. He said I was abandoning Edward. I said he never wanted him in the first place. Her voice cracked then. I left the room. I needed air. I walked the perimeter of the house, around to the back garden, and that's when I saw him, Jeremy, sitting in the nursery, just watching the crib. The vicar said nothing. He didn't see me, but he had the oddest look on his face, as if he were remembering something or deciding something. She shivered. I haven't told the police. I don't know what it means. Pettigrew gently reached across the table. You must, and you must speak to Miss Marple. Fiona nodded slowly. As if summoned, Miss Marple arrived an hour later with a tin of parsnip cakes and the faint scent of rose water. She listened quietly as the vicar relayed what Fiona had said, omitting the harshest edges, but keeping the core truth intact. Miss Marple only nodded. Thank you. It helps. That night, a sharp wind swept through the village, tearing the last of the fate posters from the notice board. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. A gate creaked. The quiet settled again like dust. And in her cottage, Miss Marple sat at her desk, turning the nursery rhyme book over in her hands. She thought of Fiona's story, of Jeremy's expression that day in the nursery, of Martin's quiet devotion, of the burn marks left precisely within the cot. She was beginning to understand. Not the whole picture. Not yet. But something had been staged. Something had been performed for the village and for the police. But the story it told was not the truth. No, the truth was still waiting for the right eyes to find it. Chapter 7. Another twist Saturday began with a knock on Miss Marple's door, firm, urgent, and entirely too early for ordinary visitors. When she opened it, Inspector Cray stood in the morning light, raincoat damp and expression unusually tight. I thought you'd want to hear it from me, he said without preamble. They've found something. Miss Marple stepped aside, wordlessly inviting him in. Cray laid a manila folder on her kitchen table, his voice unusually flat. There's a small woodland beyond the Copp's Hill turnoff, about 3 miles out. We hadn't searched it in depth. Private property and no direct line from the fete grounds. But this morning, a rambler's dog got loose, dug up something behind a stack of felled logs. Miss Marple closed the lid on her teapot with a soft click. Edward. No. Cray rubbed the bridge of his nose. A blanket. Singed. Same embroidery as the one in the crib, and under it, buried shallow, one of his baby shoes. The fire service confirmed it wasn't burned in the crib. It was scorched separately, probably days ago. Someone planted it there. Miss Marple sat down slowly. So someone staged it. Cray nodded grimly. It's not a burial, it's a message. A message to whom, I wonder? That's what we're trying to work out. But it complicates the timeline. Whoever took Edward didn't flee the village immediately. They circled back, or they never left at all. He stood, preparing to leave. We're interviewing everyone again, with new eyes this time. Keep your ears open, Miss Marple. I know you always do. When he left, Miss Marple remained seated a long moment, gaze drifting toward the embroidery sampler framed on her far wall, a verse stitched by her grandmother. The quietest voice is the one most heard when the heart knows what the mind finds absurd. Yes, she thought, it was time to listen for what wasn't being said. Later that morning, Fiona Ranscombe arrived at the village pharmacy in a daze. Her shawl was askew, and her hair, usually swept into a sleek knot, hung loose around her shoulders. Mrs. Tilbury, who had manned the counter for 40 years and prided herself on discretion, lowered her spectacles with alarm. I need something for sleeping, Fiona murmured. Anything. I can't. Mrs. Tilbury hesitated. Of course, dear. Something mild. But if I may, there's no shame in seeing someone professional. You've been through an awful time. Fiona offered no reply. She accepted the bottle and left without another word. But what Mrs. Tilbury noticed, and what she would later whisper over tea to Mrs. Hartnell, was that Fiona had paid in cash. Crisp new notes, unusual for someone who normally tapped her card. Meanwhile, Martin Fletchley had taken to walking the perimeter of the fete grounds in lonely, silent loops. The villagers avoided him now, uncertain, suspicious. He wore the guilt of too much emotion, and in a place like Little Witchwood, that was a kind of crime. Miss Marple found him near the oaks, staring at the blackened patch of earth. They say someone buried Edward's shoe, he said quietly, not turning. Like a warning, or a game. Yes, Miss Marple replied, though I wonder what sort of person thinks of shoes as a message. Martin looked down at his own. Do you think he's still alive? She didn't answer. Instead, she asked, Have you spoken with Fiona since? He nodded. I left a letter at the vicarage, just to say I'm sorry. For everything. I didn't know if it helped. You're very kind, Martin. He gave a wan smile. Not kind enough, apparently. Elsewhere in the village, something else was stirring. At the rear of the general store, young Alec Braithwaite, grandson to the proprietor, was sweeping up crates when he overheard a conversation through the half-open stockroom door. 2 delivery men from the market Hemley Depot were sorting invoices. Strangest pickup we had all week, one muttered. That Fallows Reach place? Never usually does private parcels, but early Monday just after the fete. This fella brings in a heavy box, wrapped tight, paid cash, no return address. The other man whistled. Odd timing. Alex said nothing then, but by afternoon, the story had made its way to Miss Marple through the village's invisible wire system of whispers and well-placed glances. That evening, she paid a visit to the general store under the pretext of purchasing lavender soap. Alec, spotting her, brightened. Miss Marple, did you hear about the parcel? I did. Might you recall who collected it? He shook his head. Didn't recognize him. Wore a cap low over his eyes. But he drove a black van, rattly thing, left a note on the manifest too. Said, R. Thorne, C.O. Little Drayford, no signature required. R. Thorne, Miss Marple repeated. Do you still have the manifest? Alec rummaged through a clipboard and handed it to her. She scanned the line and nodded slowly. Little Drayford was a village 2 towns over, quiet, remote, and largely agricultural. But the name Thorn made her pause. She had seen it before. Fiona Ranscombe's maiden name had been Thorn. That night, as darkness pooled around the lanes of Little Witchwood and the air turned sharp with coming frost, Miss Marple did not sleep. She took down her notes, arranged them, and made a list. Fiona's resignation from the university. Unpleasant. Jeremy's claim of amicable departure. Martin's crossed-out rhyme. Not a threat, but a plea. Burned shoe and blanket. Buried deliberately. A parcel, heavy, no return address, sent just after the fete. Addressed to R. Thorn. She reread each point again and again. Then, as the clock struck 11, she picked up her shawl, lit a lantern, and walked to Fallow's Reach. There was one more secret still buried in that house, and she intended to unearth it. Chapter 8. Miss Marple's Final Test. The lantern light danced along the gravel path leading up to Fallow's Reach, casting long, trembling shadows across the hedgerows. The house loomed ahead, its windows dark, its silence unbroken. Miss Marple, wrapped in her knitted shawl and wielding the quiet confidence of someone who had solved more murders than most detectives dared dream, stepped carefully up to the front door and knocked. Just once, firmly. A moment passed. Then footsteps. The door creaked open. Jeremy Ranscombe stood in the threshold, his shirt untucked, his hair slightly mussed. Surprise flickered across his face, quickly masked by weary civility. Miss Marple, at this hour? I'm terribly sorry to intrude, she said with polite gravity, but I'm afraid the matter couldn't wait. He hesitated. It's not a good time. Fiona is resting. She won't be disturbed, Miss Marple assured him. This is something I thought you might prefer not to discuss in the presence of others. Jeremy stepped aside slowly, and she entered. The house felt colder than before, the fire dead in the hearth, the air tinged with something sterile, like distant hospitals or forgotten attics. She noticed a suitcase beside the stairs. Half-zipped, a child's soft blanket lay folded on top. I suppose you've heard, Jeremy said stiffly, closing the door behind her. The latest development. The buried shoe, yes. Most troubling. He poured himself a drink, his hand shaking slightly as he brought the glass to his lips. I don't suppose you're here to share a theory, Miss Marple. Not yet. I'm here to ask a question. Or two. He sighed. Of course you are. She watched him closely. You mentioned earlier that Fiona left her university position on good terms, but she told the vicar something quite different, that the departure was unpleasant, that she felt forced out. He said nothing. And now there's this parcel, she went on, sent from the village post-fete, paid in cash, addressed to R. Thorn in Little Drayford. No return. A large, heavy box. Jeremy's grip on the glass faltered. You see, Miss Marple continued, her tone light as spun sugar, Fiona's maiden name was Thorn, which suggests a personal link, but she's never mentioned any relatives in Little Drayford. In fact, no one's heard her speak of family at all. I don't see what you're implying, he said, voice tightening. No. Then allow me to wonder aloud, she said gently. Might it be that Fiona was not Edward's mother? The room fell into an unnatural silence. Jeremy stared at her, unblinking. Miss Marple did not flinch. She's been devoted, certainly, but something has never quite rung true. The crib? Antique, yes, but oddly displayed. The village fete? A public event. The insistence on visible presence with the child, but only in curated moments. And now this parcel, sent with urgency, just after Edward's disappearance. A box, heavy enough to matter. He stepped back, then sat down heavily on the arm of a chair. She She couldn't keep him, he said finally. Not legally. There were complications with the adoption. Her sister's child died in an accident, the paperwork never finalized. And then Fiona, well, she wanted to raise him as her own. Miss Marple's expression softened, though her voice remained steady. And you? I wanted a life, a real one, not this elaborate fiction. We came here because Fiona thought the village would accept anything if it looked sweet enough. But something changed, Miss Marple said. He nodded. She became obsessive, terrified someone would take Edward away, and when the fate came, she insisted we show him off. I warned her it would only draw attention, that someone might ask questions. And then? Jeremy stared into the fireless grate. She staged the disappearance. She wanted to burn the crib as a symbol, to make it look like he'd been stolen or worse, so that no one would search too deeply. She said people accept tragedy more than ambiguity. But that wasn't the plan, was it? Miss Marple asked softly. You sent the parcel. He blinked. I couldn't stop her, but I could undo it. The morning after, I took Edward while she slept, packed his things, sent him to my cousin in Little Drayford. Robert Thorne is a name we used once. Fiona's father. I thought it would keep him safe. Miss Marple exhaled slowly. So Edward is alive? Yes. Safe. And Fiona? She doesn't know. She thinks someone took him from the crib while she was fetching milk, but there was no fire. I burned the blanket afterward. She was distraught, yes, but she believes he's truly gone. It was easier for her to believe that than to risk losing him in court. Miss Marple's voice was a whisper. You let her grieve a living child. She wouldn't have let go otherwise. Miss Marple rose to her feet. You must tell Inspector Cray. Tonight. I will, he said after a long pause. But not yet. I need a few hours. She looked at him, not with pity, but with the grave weariness of someone who had seen many types of broken people and many shades of love gone terribly wrong. You've created quite the illusion, Mr. Ranscombe, but illusions, like fires, leave ashes, and ashes always tell a story. She left the house, the mist now curling low across the ground like fingers pulling at her skirts. In the distance, the church bell struck midnight. Behind her, a man sat alone in a house full of secrets, and ahead of her, a village still believed a child had vanished into smoke, but the truth had never disappeared. It had only been mailed. Chapter 9. The reveal, morning dawned brittle and grey, the clouds hanging low over Little Witchwood as though the sky itself had grown weary of silence. Word spread quickly, first in murmurs over post-boxes and hedgerows, then in firmer tones over breakfast tables and tea trays. Inspector Cray had returned to Fallows Reach just after sunrise. No one knew why, but the presence of the police car outside the Ranscombe house, engine running, had stirred the village like a breeze through tinder. Miss Marple, meanwhile, sat in her drawing room, calmly arranging her knitting basket, though she had no intention of picking up her needles. She was waiting. At precisely 10 minutes past 9, a knock came. Not hurried, not fearful, just expected. Inspector Cray entered with a face like a sealed envelope. Hard to read, but clearly containing something of weight. You knew, he said. I suspected, Miss Marple replied gently. And I had to be sure Jeremy would tell you, not just me. Cray sat without asking. He rubbed a hand through his hair, unusually disheveled. He came in around 4, told the whole story. We found the address on the parcel manifest and rang the cousin. Edward's there, safe, sleeping, happy apparently. Miss Marple allowed herself the faintest exhale of relief. And Fiona? Cray hesitated. Still doesn't know. We're debating how to proceed. It's not a criminal matter, technically. There's no legal guardian, no proof of kidnapping, but the deception, the way they both let the village believe. "It was meant to bury the truth in grief," Miss Marple said. "And grief, as we both know, is a kind of fog. It makes people stop asking questions." Cray shook his head slowly. "You're right. She believed he'd been taken. She really did. But part of her must have known, somewhere inside, that she'd built something too fragile, and it had to fall." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the revelation settling in like dust. "And what of the villagers?" Miss Marple asked quietly. Cray gave a humorless smile. "They'll believe what they need to. Perhaps we'll say the child was found abandoned in the next county, anonymously. It spares them shame. And her." Miss Marple nodded. "Very wise." Just before Cray left, he paused by the door. "There was one thing I didn't understand," he said. "Why the burned shoe and blanket? Why go to the trouble?" Miss Marple folded her hands. "Because Jeremy wanted it to look like something terrible had happened. Something final. He didn't trust Fiona to let go otherwise, and he didn't trust the system to solve what was, at its heart, not a crime, but a collapse. So he performed grief, carefully, symbolically. Like a stage play," Cray muttered. "Precisely. And he knew a fire in a crib would speak louder than any confession." When he was gone, Miss Marple prepared her hat and coat and took her usual route through the village. The fog was lifting slightly now, and people were beginning to emerge. She nodded to Mrs. Tilbury outside the chemist, paused to admire Mrs. Denton's window display, greeted Mr. Aberley, who was cleaning his milk cart with undue vigor. The village, as it always had, was returning to itself, but the unease lingered. By noon, Fiona Ranscombe had also left Fallow's reach. She did not slam the door or shout. She simply walked, shawl wrapped tightly, head high. Some say she boarded a train at Market Hemley without telling a soul. Others claimed she moved in with a cousin in Devon, or fled to France, or joined a convent. No one could confirm. Jeremy remained a few days longer. He answered the questions that needed answering, signed papers with Inspector Cray, and visited the cousin in Little Drayford. Whether he brought Edward home or made other arrangements, the village never knew for certain, and perhaps it was better that way. On Sunday, the church bells rang as they always had. The pews were full. There was a hushed reverence in the air, as if the congregation understood that something had passed among them, a spectre not of violence, but of sorrow concealed by performance. After the service, Miss Marple lingered by the yew trees with Reverend Pettigrew. "You were right," he said softly. "There were secrets, deep ones." "There always are," Miss Marple replied. "But not all secrets wish to be exposed. Some only want to be understood." He tilted his head. "And Edward? A child like any other. Innocent, loved in his way, and I suspect better off now." The vicar nodded, but his expression remained troubled. "Do you think Fiona ever truly believed she was his mother?" Miss Marple didn't answer immediately. She watched a robin hop along the stone path, pausing to peck at a dropped crumb. "I believe," she said finally, "that Fiona wanted to love something she could never truly hold. And sometimes, when people try to hold too tightly, they end up letting go without meaning to." As she walked back through the village, the fog had fully burned away. The trees glistened with dew, and the roses in the Marple garden had begun to bloom again, late for the season, but stubborn. She returned to her chair, took up her knitting, and finally resumed her pearl stitch. And though the mystery of the burned crib had come to an end, the quiet question it left behind still echoed softly, like the faint cry of a child long since gone. Who are we when we cannot prove the love we claim to hold? The answer, Miss Marple knew, was never in evidence. It was always in observation. Chapter 10. Aftermath. A week had passed since the last of the police cars left Little Witchwood. The bunting had long since been folded and boxed, the fete grounds cleared of ash and trampled grass. Life had begun to resume its gentle rhythms. But for those who had been touched, truly touched, by the mystery of the crib with burn marks, the air still held something faintly unsettled, like the quiet before a storm that never comes. Miss Marple, for her part, never sought praise. She did not announce her involvement, nor did she share the full story with those who asked. She smiled, offered vague comments about how things often come right in time, and redirected the conversation toward jam recipes or the curious lack of foxglove blooms this year. In truth, the village didn't want the story. Not all of it. They wanted resolution without confrontation, peace without knowing too much. So when Inspector Cray shared the official update that Edward Ranscombe had been found unharmed in a nearby county, placed anonymously in the care of a relative, it was enough. People nodded solemnly. They blessed the child's return, and they never asked who had sent him there. Fiona Ranscombe's absence was spoken of with a kind of delicate avoidance. She had, according to a vague note left at the vicarage, gone to seek clarity and rest. Her departure was accepted the way one accepts a marriage ending quietly, or a house standing suddenly empty. No one admitted relief, but no one wished her back. Jeremy stayed on for a time, making arrangements to rent out Fallow's Reach. He was polite, subdued, and spoke little in public. When Miss Marple passed him one day outside the stationer's, he tipped his hat and said only, "Thank you," for knowing how not to say what didn't need saying. Miss Marple smiled. "People often imagine I know more than I do. I find that helps them speak freely." He nodded, understanding her perfectly. The day he left the village, Martin Fletchley stood by the edge of the fete field, staring at the trees where the creche had once been. Miss Marple found him there, alone, shoulders hunched against the wind. "She's not coming back, is she?" he asked quietly. Miss Marple shook her head. "No, dear, I don't believe she is. I wasn't in love with her. Not really, I just wanted to feel needed, like I could protect something." She rested a gentle hand on his arm. "There's no shame in that. Many terrible things are done in the name of love. But so are many good ones." He didn't reply, but his posture eased, and after a moment he walked away, toward the village, toward a life still ahead. In the days that followed, the fete was mentioned less and less. The scorch marks in the grass faded under rain and regrowth. The whispers quieted. And yet some things lingered. The vicar, once shy around Miss Marple's deductions, now kept a reserved seat for her at every parish meeting. Mrs. Tilbury began selling baby books with a strange reverence, as if touching their pages might call back what was lost. And Mrs. Price, who had once declared Fiona odd with gusto, now spoke of her with a curious softness. Poor soul, I suppose we never really knew her. Miss Marple often sat in her garden now, knitting by the wall of old roses, letting the breeze lift the lace curtains through her open window. She thought often of Edward, not of the crime or the deception or the terrible silence, but of the child himself. Safe, at last. Placed with someone who could love him without fear of unraveling. It was not the neatest ending, not the one a courtroom would deliver, but it was the true one. And in Little Witchwood, truth often wore disguises. One afternoon, as the postman handed Miss Marple her mail, he added almost off-handedly, "Strange, isn't it, that we all thought it was a kidnapping?" Miss Marple, without looking up, replied, "Well, that's the trouble with fires. They make everything look like a crime." He laughed, uncertain, and walked on. When she opened the last letter in the stack, her hands paused. It was unsigned, written in a delicate, unfamiliar hand, and bore no return address. It read, "Thank you for protecting what was left of the truth. I may not have been his mother, but I loved him the best I could. Tell him someday that I tried. F." Miss Marple folded the letter slowly and placed it in the drawer beneath her teacups. She did not cry. She did not speak. She simply returned to her chair, picked up her needles, and resumed her knitting. And all through Little Witchwood the wind rustled through the hedgerows, not mournful, not foreboding, just quiet, just human, just enough.